You might be struggling to get through some particularly complicated philosophical text that isn't like the literature you're used to. And when it comes to philosophy, the literature game is no joke. Today, we'll take a closer look at the subject of death and suicide. We'll be taking a look at the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche and David Hume. The star of this conversation will be Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book for all and none. One of Nietzsche's most popular texts, and may be intimidating to read, but we'll make it through this discussion alive. For me, getting some more background information on the writer is a great way to begin deciphering what the heck they're talking about. Context is important. We'll be focusing in particular on what it means to analyze difficult or hard to read writing and to gain a better understanding of how to analyze philosophical texts. Think of this as a crash course in philosophy minus our cool internet uncle, Hank Green.
Saying you're a kid, it's like saying I'm a kid.
Here's your goober meal, sir.
I'm supposed to get a toy with this? Thanks.
With that being said, let's take a look into the life of Friedrich Nietzsche. He was born October 15th, 1844 in Roerken, Saxony, in what was then Prussia, now present-day Germany. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a pastor and died of a brain ailment. Nietzsche was 5 at the time, and the tragedy was followed by the death of his younger brother, Ludwig Joseph, who was only 2 years old. His mother, Franziska, took Nietzsche and his younger sister by 2 years, Elizabeth Alexandra, to live with his paternal grandmother and his 2 aunts. In 1858, when Nietzsche was 14, he attended a first-rate boarding school until he graduated at the age of 19, attending the University of Bonn in 1864. He studied philology and focused on classical and biblical texts. In 1865, Nietzsche studied at the University of Leipzig, and at the age of 23, he began his required military service. However, after sustaining a serious chest injury that didn't want to heal, Nietzsche was put on sick leave and returned to Leipzig. There, he met composer Richard Wagner, and the two developed a close bond. In 1869, Nietzsche was offered a professorial position at the University of Basel in Switzerland at the age of 24. There, he became good and dear friends with historian Franz Overbeck, who will be important later on. In October of 1870, while serving as a medical attendant during the Franco-Prussian War, Nietzsche developed more health complications as he had contracted diphtheria and dysentery. After his service ended in October, he once more resumed his academic work until his health no longer permitted him, and he resigned in June of 1879. Talk about an early retirement. At the age of 34, Nietzsche suffered frequent migraines and eyesight problems. Still, he traveled throughout Europe. In 1882, Nietzsche met Louvain Salomé on a trip to Rome and fell in love with the 21-year-old Russian philosopher. He also met Paul Rée, and the two newfound friends ended up cutting ties with Nietzsche and moved to Berlin. This would come as a low point for Nietzsche, as Salome had such an emotional impact on him. To lose both his friends, one of which was the love of his life, would leave Nietzsche terribly lonely. He began writing extensively, which is where the book for today's topic comes in. From 1883 to 1885, Nietzsche wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra in 4 parts. Unfortunately, on the morning of January 3, 1889, at 44 years old, Nietzsche experienced a mental breakdown while in Turin, Italy. He had been wandering the streets when he saw a coachman whipping a horse. Upset, Nietzsche flung his arms around the horse's neck, where he would collapse and never recover his mental state. Soon after, he began writing some alarming letters to friends and family, including his friend from Basel, Franz Overbeck. Overbeck, being the good friend that he was, sought out Nietzsche to bring him back to Basel. At the time of his hospitalization, he was diagnosed with syphilis, an unfortunately common disease at the time. It is believed he might have contracted it during his time serving in the Franco-Prussian War, although others claim he must have contracted it through intercourse at a brothel. Some of those health problems he had might have been signs of early stages of syphilis. The migraines and eye problems also make sense and line up with his being very sickly and having a sudden burst of inspiration during his intense writing periods. Nietzsche himself looked back on memories of his father's own ill health and wondered if he had somehow inherited whatever ailments caused his father's suffering. The last years of his life were spent with him being cared for by others as he was suffering atypical general paresis, for atypical general paralysis caused by dormant tertiary syphilis. Later diagnoses included degeneration of the cerebral blood vessels and a retroorbital meningioma, which is a tumor of the brain meninges behind his right eye. He spent some time in a sanatorium before his mother took him back to Naumburg in 1890. After his mother passed away, his sister Elizabeth took over his care, and it was here when Elizabeth began using her older brother's writings to further her anti-Semitic views. Elizabeth was married to an anti-Semite by the name of Bernard Forster, who died by suicide. After her husband's death, Elizabeth used Friedrich's work to resemble hers and Bernard's anti-Semitic beliefs, resulting in the linkage of Nietzsche with fascism and Adolf Hitler. Friedrich Nietzsche would ultimately succumb to health complications on August 25, 1900, at the age of 55, when he died of a stroke that was complicated by pneumonia. His sister Elizabeth had him buried in Weimar alongside their mother. Nietzsche lived through a pivotal moment in the history of present-day Germany as we know it, a war and unification. His writings reflected his concern on socio-political practices and what he felt was a lack of education from the church in terms of providing guidance on how one should live one's life. And with an end to the life of Nietzsche, let's get into one of his most famous works. This work is one of the last things Nietzsche had written before the turn of his mental health left him incapacitated. I have an English translated Cambridge copy, and it's a decent size. It's about 266 pages. But looks can be deceiving, and this little book, despite its small size, is a difficult read. But because today we are focusing on death, we will be looking at specific chapters that delve into it. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is filled with biblical allusions and nature metaphors, and as I went through it, there were some I caught and many I can only assume I missed. But the purpose of this video isn't for you to know a biblical allusion every time you see one. It's to help you recognize something that you don't understand, even if you can easily read the words. Not understanding and venturing to learn is at the core of the philosophical process. And the moment you recognize that you don't understand something, you're one step closer to analyzing what it means. This is reflected in Zarathustra as a character and his journey to understand what it all means.
What does it mean? What does it all mean?
In On Free Death, the character Zarathustra begins by reflecting on when we die. I should preface by stating that I don't feel Nietzsche writes Zarathustra to literally be Zoroaster. Zarathustra as a character is more symbolic and almost a stand-in for us, the audience, wondering as he wanders. I digress. Zarathustra begins the scene with, "Many die too late and some die too early. The doctrine still sounds strange. Die at the right time." This we might take to mean that some of us live to a very old age or to the point where we become very frail and unable to care for ourselves. And some of us die very young, which may lead others to feel that we died early or too soon. And then that doctrine bit at the end, die at the right time. Here's where we get into the philosophical questioning of it all. What does it mean to die at the right time? What is meant by right time? Zarathustra continues on by stating, "My death I praise to you, the free death that comes to me because I want." And continues, "For some, life fails. A poisonous worm eats its way to their heart. Let them see to it that their dying succeeds all the more. Some never become sweet. They rot already in summer. It is cowardice that keeps them clinging to the branch." Here, Zarathustra is acknowledging that there is a freedom to and freedom from when it comes to death. We have the freedom to die to an extent, and that we all will die. But some of us can choose to check that off our list before others. When he mentions life failing for some, we can see a recognition of pain and suffering. That doesn't exactly condemn the taking of your own life. And if you take your own life, aren't you still technically dying at the right time? If some otherworldly being or superior force dictates everything that happens to us, then surely even if someone decides to die by their own hands, they are dying at the right time. Zarathustra voices his frustrations with those who disagree and take a more Christian perspective. There is a big focus in this religion on suffering, and that there is a greater meaning and purpose to your suffering. But to talk about death and suffering and Nietzsche, I want for us to take an extra step and hop over to French philosopher David Hume. In Hume's small text on suicide, one of the first sentences states, "If suicide be criminal, it must be a transgression of our duty, either to God, our neighbor, or ourselves." Now, that's about as straightforward as you can get when it comes to philosophy. However, there's quite a bit to unpack. Keep in mind as we go over Hume's writing what we just talked about, dying at the right time and free death. Hume makes the argument that if God has made us and we owe everything to God and his creations, then if suicide were wrong or against God, he would not have made it possible for suicide to exist. There would be no such thing. So, because we can take our own life, that must mean it's not against God. Hume follows it up with, "And may he not lawfully employ that power with which nature has endowed him?" Zarathustra states us clinging to life despite suffering so much is cowardice due to our fear of death thanks to religion. Hume validates suicidal thoughts and the act itself because whoever is suicidal must be going through severe pain. It's about accepting the reality that some people lead extremely harsh lives, riddled with an emotional and mental baggage not everyone can readily handle. Hume states, "For such is our natural horror of death, that small motives will never be able to reconcile us to it. And though perhaps the situation of a man's health or fortune did not seem to require this remedy, we may at least be assured that anyone who, without apparent reason, has had recourse to it, was cursed with such an incurable depravity or gloominess of temper as must poison all enjoyment, and render him equally miserable, as if he had been loaded with the most grievous misfortune." Here, Hume talks about the nuances of what could lead one to suicide. It can be spur of the moment, something done in an effort to prevent some other harm that we wish to avoid. It can be an end to suffering, or something one is pressured into. Hume acknowledges that life is hard, harder for some, and that it's not ungodly to take your own life. We try our best to take care of and protect ourselves, that we know that should anyone have decided to go out by their own volition, we can only presume that their pain, whatever it was too much for them to bear. Similarly, Nietzsche reflects this in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he writes, "Would that preachers of the quick death came, but I hear only preaching of the slow death and patience with all things earthly." This goes back to that Christian belief of suffering for a purpose, that it's all a part of God's greater plan for us. It almost feels as if there's a subliminal message here, that each of us is unique, and therefore each of us have our own special suffering that God gives us. Therefore, we should each be satisfied with our suffering. Now, that particular idea may not be as practiced now, but it was something that Nietzsche clearly felt he should address, especially when we take into consideration the important role that religion played for people in his family and the focus of his studies in college. This bit is crucial to question, because how do we figure out the point behind all this suffering? Are we supposed to continuously look to God for the answer? What if we don't recognize the answer? In other words, if we're suffering for a purpose, what is the purpose of the suffering if we can't figure it out? In other words, if we are suffering for a purpose, what is the purpose of the suffering if you can't figure out what life lesson is in it? There is an implication in this particular religious approach that those who decide they don't want to suffer any longer should be condemned. Hume makes it clear that anyone who decides to take their own life must be going through something horrible, and that we should consider it as if they were going through the worst. The message being, we shouldn't criticize people in these situations, but try to be more sympathetic of why they would make such a drastic final choice. While Hume's writing is a bit more straightforward and provides us with some tools to analyze the more complicated reading of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But what about choosing death because it's for a cause you believe in? Remember, Zarathustra is on a journey of understanding, and we're following along with him, so it's important to adopt that questioning mindset to better understand the text. Not all people choose to die based on ending their own suffering. Some die for specific causes, in which case we often refer to them as martyrs. Hume thinks that martyrdom is basically suicide, because you're still dying as a result of your own choice. Along similar lines, Nietzsche mentions Jesus Christ as someone who died too early, the one who is honored by the preachers of slow death. It was a pretty painful death for Christ, crucified, shoulders out of their sockets, hands nailed, being lashed, the whole thing. If he had wished for death to overcome him in that moment, I don't know that many would blame him. But Nietzsche is criticizing the opinion that awful pain and suffering are simply God's plan and nothing more. Zarathustra ends his speech by addressing his friends, "Thus I myself want to die, so that you, my friends, love the earth more for my sake. And I want to become earth again, so that I may have peace in the one who bore me." That last bit can be taken both literally and metaphorically. Welcome to the world of philosophy. Zarathustra isn't exactly saying his life is all pain and suffering, but that he isn't afraid to die because death can be as much liberation as it is a finality. And in missing him, his friends will love him all the more and love the earth all the more. Lastly, by becoming earth again, Zarathustra is referring to the literal decomposition process that all living organisms go through. It's just part of the circle of life. And by making his peace with the one who bore him, he means he will make peace with earth. Of course, the one who bore me would make one think of birth, in which case one would think he suggests making peace with his mother. However, this is a case of looking at another possibility. We know that there are many ways to refer to our planet, one of them being Mother Earth. It's safe to say that for the context of this video, Nietzsche is referring to that circle of life, that all that lives must die to nourish that which will live, on and on it goes. Hopefully, you were able to follow along with some of the connections I was making between the two texts, one of which was much easier to understand than the other. But really the best way to get through a philosophical text is to be patient with yourself and with the writings. Some of them are harder than others and require multiple readings before you have your eureka moment, whereas other readings you get on the first try. It's important to notice when some are more straightforward, like Hume's, and when you're going to need some more literary deduction to interpret, as well as extra time to adjust, sit and think on it. I said adjust. Every philosopher writes differently, and there will be those that you prefer over others. In summary, it's important to realize that the whole purpose of these philosophical writings is to get you to think, to ask questions. Confusion is all right. Questioning is encouraged. And the more you read, the easier it will become to understand new texts, and the more confident you will be the next time you read philosophy. Unless you just don't want to read, and that's the hill you choose to die on. In any case, we just spent this whole video decoding that your choice is your choice. So do as Zarathustra suggests and have some courage, for courage is the best slayer. Courage that attacks, it slays even death. For it says, was that life? Well then, one more time.